Hey, good morning. Yes, I'm Chris Jackal. This is Mehan from Google. He will be sort of seated here for a while I talk interminably. But if you have questions sort of later about GCS or some of the integration things that we're going to cover today, feel free to talk to him at any point. So, as Josh said, we are very happy that you are here. We are very grateful that you are giving up your time to come listen to us, to come learn about Fastly. Just so I know kind of the scope of the people in the room, who is not a Fastly customer? Like currently an active Fastly customer? This one at the back, two, okay. There will be some step-by-step of going through and configuring things. If you're not familiar with Fastly, by all means sort of ask a neighbor. Most of the instructions are fairly straightforward, but you will be going through the configuration system to do stuff. For the people who are Fastly customers, who is not currently using the logging system at all? Who's not logging things? Some few of you? Okay. Well, by the end of this, you will be, one way or another. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the logging system. We will set up on a kind of test account for you folks a couple different endpoints that you're going to be writing some logs to. We're going to be changing around what you will be logging. We're going to talk a whole bunch about JSON logging, which is great, and then other fun things that you might want to do with logs. But all of this is ultimately about giving you insight into what is actually happening at the edge. For those of you who are using the logs already, you kind of know the power of what's available. I think by the end of this, though, what we would like is that you will have a better understanding of some of the things that you can do with it, than the knowledge that you can get of what your clients are actually doing, like your customers, how they're interacting with your application. And we have some exciting things that we can do where potentially out of your kind of logging data pipeline, you could actually rip out a big part of the middleware and use us just to kind of log data and information directly into a database or some other log format, potentially getting rid of a bunch of servers. So we'll talk about that at the end. So first things first. Fastly, historically, has named our internal system components after ski hills in Tahoe. I don't know why. The founders really like to ski. They spend a lot of time at Tahoe. And so the configuration management system is called Heavenly. And our API is called North Star. And so there was this naming convention that we would name things after ski hills. And that sort of stuck with a while. Our logging system, though, was originally written by Adam at the back. This is Adam's dog. Adam's dog is way more popular in the office than Adam's. Adam's a nice guy, but his dog, much nicer. And he named it Bullet, except he didn't call it this bullet, he called it that bullet. You might want to talk to him about more detail about that. But the reason I mention this is because I'm going to slip up at some point, and I'm going to refer to our logging system as Bullet. Now you know what I'm talking about. But more importantly, you should know that the logging system is separate. It is distinct from our configuration system and from the Varnish cast nodes themselves. So we have POPs all over the world. We do not send logs from each of our POPs to the logging endpoints, like into a bucket or into your syslog or whatever. We have a series of aggregators. And those aggregators are part of the whole sort of Bullet system. So Varnish itself has the ability to send a log line. And that log line is just a string. But the details of where that log information has to go, Varnish has no idea of what that is. It just knows a name of like a syslog endpoint that you've configured somewhere. But it doesn't have the credentials. It doesn't know the details of that endpoint. All it's doing is it's just sending out a string with the details of whatever you configured for all the different fields that it actually needs to send out. So here's how this flow works. And this is important because we'll be configuring a lot of logs, and it sort of explains why there's some quirks in our configuration system for how you actually interact with the logging system. You, as an user, will connect either to our portal or to the API, and in one of the service configurations, you will configure a logging endpoint. You'll give it all the details of how to connect. A token to connect, or the Google credentials, whatever it is that it needs to get in. That will then talk to our control plane. The control plane will build your configuration. It has all the information that it needs to know for the credentials for how to connect. And it knows the information that you had for the fields of what it is that you want to log. It will then compile that and send it out to Varnish as the VCL that you're used to seeing, like the generated VCL. But all that VCL has is the name of the endpoint. So at the same time, our configuration system sends out to the log aggregators, Bullet, the details of how to connect to the endpoint and sort of the credentials for that. So we will make configuration changes in about 5 seconds. You log in, you make a change. The exception to that is changes to Bullet take a little bit longer to propagate. Still usually under a minute, but it has to push those out, and then the individual aggregators have to know about this new endpoint. It has to establish new connections. It has to open a file somewhere. So as we're going through stuff today, we'll be making some changes. We'll be hitting sort of refresh, refresh, refresh. We'll be generating some traffic towards things. It will take slightly longer than a normal configuration change for some of that content to start showing up in a bucket, or if you change the fields that you're logging, it'll take a little bit longer than 5 seconds for some of those changes to flow through. So the logging aggregators, we currently have around 10 or 12 of them. They're scattered around at different places. There is no predictable way to know which POPs are going to be talking to which aggregator. Most of the time, this doesn't matter. It will sort of matter when you're writing to a file, but we'll get into that. We send a lot of logs. Now, if we're, on any given day, we're doing like 5 million requests per second, we might be sending about 2 million logs per second, which is a lot. We have some customers, some of our biggest customers, who log every single request that they do. Some customers log them twice. They log them to different endpoints for different reasons, or they log errors to one direction and they log different types of traffic in other directions. So the aggregators that are there, there's about 10 or 12 of them. There will be more over time. For those of you who are logging to files, when we write to a file, hopefully not to FTP, but if it is to a bucket or something like that, you're going to see a bunch of different files for each of the time periods that are there. For the duration of this workshop, you're going to need 2 sets of credentials. Now, some of the folks sort of handed out two little pieces of paper. If you don't have any, or if people come in, we'll sort of get you more. One is the Google credentials that we're going to use for a bucket and for some BigQuery stuff later. The other one is just a mysterious number. You don't need to know. We'll use that number for the service that you're going to configure, but all the credentials that you want are going to be here. And most of the stuff that we're going to be going through is going to be on this site, www.loggingworkshop.com. Best $12 I ever spent registering this domain. So we're going to be creating a service within Fastly, and it will be a subdomain of loggingworkshop.com. It will be your area. There'll be a few places where we need to be specific about how you're going to be sending logs, so that you send logs just to a place that don't conflict with anybody else. But for the most part, you can go to loggingworkshop.com. And to keep things separate, you should definitely make sure you log out of any existing Fastly accounts. And if you're logged into Google, you're going to want to make sure you either log out of Google for some of the later steps, or use an incognito mode, because you're going to need different credentials to get into that. Well, let's quickly, there's only a couple of people who aren't familiar with Fastly, but we're just going to go through this quickly, and just to give you, to get everybody into the place where they need to be. We will create a quick service. So within this Fastly account, you're going to log into manage.fastly.com with the email address logging.workshop@gmail.com, and the password is altitudesf. So that's available under the workshop resources part of this page. So the second page of the www.loggingworkshop.com has the 3 different places we're going to be logging into. 2 of them, manage.fastly.com, and we're going to be looking at log entries briefly. You can use the same email and the same password. For the Google stuff, which we will get to later, there's a second piece of paper which has a Google account and password. Anyone not have the little pieces of paper? Good. The number, the random, mostly random number that you got. We're going to use that as the service that you create. And every time that somewhere in the steps of what it is that you're going to be doing today, when it says your number, use your number. As you can tell, we've already actually used yournumber.loggingworkshop.com. You could actually use anything, but this at least makes sure that people won't step on each other. Has everyone been able to log in to manage.fastly.com? Okay. At any point throughout this, you can sort of raise your hand. People will be able to help you. If everybody's busted, then we can figure this out. I did move a few things around last night, so we're going to be learning together on how some of this stuff works. So the first thing we're going to do, we will create a service if you have not yet already. And for a name, you can, this is just a label. You can use pretty much anything you want. I'm going to use a number sort of higher than where most of you folks should be. And for the domain, you're going to use yournumber.loggingworkshop.com. And the address of the origin is going to be origin.loggingworkshop.com. And the only other thing that you're going to want to change is you're going to want to change to no, do not enable TLS to origin. So your number as the domain, that'll be the front end of the website that you're going to connect to when you want to just sort of generate some traffic. All of this stuff should be laid out in section 3 of the website. I'm going to create a service with the name, domain, address, verify certificate to no, and then create the service. So the domain will be whatever number that it is you're using, .loggingworkshop.com. So that will be the front end of this service. We will listen for that service for any traffic that you tend to hit it. So I'm going to be doing kind of both sides of this simultaneously. In theory, I will be copying and pasting much the same as you from the www.loggingworkshop.com website, which has all the credentials and details, transferring them over into the pieces that we're configuring. If any of that information is missing or doesn't make sense, let someone know. So we have set it up. We say enable TLS no. And you can leave pretty much the rest of this blank, and then create. You will be on version 1 of your service, of the service that you just created. It is currently active. That means that, in theory, you could go to the one that you just made, loggingworkshop.com. So the website that you will end up hitting at yournumber.loggingworkshop.com will be the same as www. It'll be the same content that's in behind it because everybody's going to be pointing at origin.loggingworkshop.com. So we're going to give people another just a couple minutes because there's, or a minute or so. You log into manage. We will create a service. The step-by-step is on the www.loggingworkshop.com on section 3 for kind of how to create a service. Once that service is created, it will be available to get traffic, and that, at least, will be the shared starting place that we can all work from. While we're making sure people get caught up, just for information, services are versioned. Once you have made a change to a version and activated it, it's locked. You can't go back and make changes to that one. You can always revert to a previous version. It should take about 5 seconds or so to roll back. Similarly, though, changes that if you made them to to a logging endpoint, that has to get pushed out a little bit, so that can sometimes take a little bit longer if you roll that back. If I look through the services that are created, let's see how many we got. Might need to refresh. I see many numbers. This is excellent. For those of you who may not have used the Fastly portal recently, this all services thing is relatively new and is awesome. It's a little crunched because I've made a weird size to this video, to the screen. So there was one step in there. I mentioned it once. It's sort of on the instructions, but it defaults to yes on enable TLS to origin. Do not do that. So where it says enable TLS, change that to no. So TLS to origin should be off, and it should only be HTTP throughout, if you're looking at HTTP. On the origin configuration. So we had a service. How are we doing on time? All right, let's do this quickly. So services are versioned. We're going to make a change. I'm going to clone the active version of the one that I just made. And again, if you're not familiar with Fastly, and I sort of apologize, we're skipping ahead for a couple of people. We have people who can help you out or sort of peer over the shoulders of people next to you. We're going to add a quick logging endpoint just so we can sort of see where some logs go. And in this case, we're on section 4 of the step-by-step. So you're going to clone the active version. We're going to select a log entries endpoint. And we have a lot of good logging partners. I've picked one more or less at random here, but you're sort of welcome to try out a bunch of these. The layout's a little weird because I've got both video or both screens side by side. But we're going to configure a new endpoint. We're going to give it a name, and we're going to call mine, since my number in this case is 95. And I'm going to give it sort of a specific name. I'm just going to say log entries, just so it has a name. Leave the log format the same. This is just the sort of default normal Apache style logs. And it's going to need a token. And the token is on the website on section 4 under step 3. I beg your pardon? It'll be the same token for everyone. So these are all going to go into the same log entries sort of endpoint, but they'll be different. We'll filter by the name of the endpoint that you've configured it on. You can leave the advanced options, everything the same. So on your particular service, you're going to create a new log endpoint. It's going to be a log entries type. It's going to use this token, and you create. And then once you create, it will. I wonder if I'm having problems connecting. Once you create that endpoint, you're going to want to activate that version and then give it a few seconds. So you're going to want to generate a little bit of traffic to your site. In this case, mine is 95 at loggingworkshop.com. You can refresh a bunch of times. You can sort of click around, load some things. I would normally, since I normally do a little soft count to 5 in my head when I make a configuration change, when I'm making a logging configuration change, I do kind of more like a 15, 20 second count. So any traffic that I'm sending right now may not actually be getting through. We can use that time though. So on section 2 of the sort of workshop steps, there are the credentials to log into log entries. And in this case, it's the same email. It is logging.workshop@gmail.com, and the same password, altitudesf. So you can use that time to log into log entries. I'm not an expert in log entries. You're welcome to sort of dig around and do anything you want with it. But what we're going to do is we're just going to look into the logs that are there. and you can select the 99 Fastly endpoint. I'm just going to think about it for a second. One of the nice things about log entries is, like, we're streaming logs in real time. They show up in log entries really fast. And we're going to take the last 5 minutes or so. Now, there's going to be a bunch of logs from a lot of different people in here. You should be, once your stuff is sort of hooked up, you send some traffic to it, you should be able to find some logs from, if you filter by the name of the logging endpoint that you created. So in my case, it was 95LE. I may need to send some more traffic to it. They do have a live tail. There we go. So there's stuff coming from different people here. And you should be able to, under the filter, potentially you could filter by the sort of endpoint name that you created. If you didn't give it sort of a complicated name, potentially 47 will find just 47s. Maybe just 47. Yeah, so that can work. We're not going to dig around in here a whole lot. One thing with log entries, they do have a kind of community pack, so it gives you a whole bunch of sample VCL for how to create a, sort of some variables to use. It will create some dashboards. This thing with log entries, though, the whole point is really just to kind of show you just creating a logging endpoint. Most of you have already done that in one capacity or another. But when we're streaming to a sort of an endpoint, that business with all the different aggregators, that doesn't really, you don't care about all that. The data just kind of arrives. It does show up when we're writing to a file, like if we're writing to a bucket. And so we're going to do that here next. As well, the variables that we're using, like that was just the default log string, super boring. There's way more fun, like interesting things that we can use in there. So in the kind of next section of this, logging variables, there's some suggestions of some links to different docs that have a whole long list of VCL variables that are there. Some of the more interesting ones, for sure, you can get all the client geo information. You can get city, country, that kind of thing. You can log all that. You can certainly get more TLS information if you want to know if they're hitting on 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, if you're trying to get some data about the different types of devices that are connecting to you. We do expose some TCP information, like some RTT times. Those aren't always as helpful as you would think, but they are potentially available. Fastly info state, very helpful because it tells you if things were a hit or a miss, or if they were coming from cache, or we served them stale, or whatever. But the nice thing is that you can also you can get expressions. Like you can evaluate something in VCL, which will then turn into a string, which you can then start doing a bunch of logic on. So you can actually sort of create derived data and do math or assemble things or sort of pack them all together into a way before you actually log them. So for example, this is very small. If you wanted to know, I'll just make this window bigger. If you wanted to know whether or not there is actually a variable for whether or not it is TLS, but also there's a couple different ways, like headers that we insert. If it's SSL, we're going to add a header, rec HTTP SSL. There's actually a direct variable now for sort of is TLS as well. But if you want to do sort of a if statement where it's if it's this, otherwise that, the C-string escape is very handy for variables that might have weird characters in them, or you need to clean those up, like escape it all before you actually try to log it. I would encourage you for sort of later, like for the rest of these, when you want to start logging some interesting things, to dig around in some of these links, because these links have big, long lists of pretty much everything that we expose. And this is the nice thing about the actual logs. You can totally customize it to get details of the requests that are not normally available and information about the client that is not normally available, like that kind of TCP information or about the actual TLS information, which you would never otherwise get at your application because it is directly what's coming from the client. There is, before we, actually, yeah, let's do one quick thing, or one more thing, and then we will probably take a quick break. We're going to create another endpoint. Now, you can have lots of different endpoints all going at the same time, and you can actually technically sort of log the same thing. You can log to the same endpoint more than once, because you can actually call VCL log more than once. But we're going to end up with a few different endpoints going in different directions. That's totally fine. We're going to create a GCS bucket. Now, the parent bucket is actually already created. What you're going to do is you're going to create a folder within that bucket that your logs are going to go into, just so that they're separate from everybody else. So at this point, you will need your Google credentials. So the first thing we'll do is create the logging endpoint within Fastly. So you're going to go back to your service configuration, and we're going to add another. You will have to clone the version first to give you a version that you can work on. So we're going to add another logging endpoint, create a new endpoint. In this case, it is going to be a cloud storage bucket. And this is laid out in step 6 of the website. For the name, this is just a label in here, sort of. Like this will be what it configures, but so you can call it your number, and we can call it GCS. There's one step in here which is very, 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 very important. So I'm going to say it once, and then we're going to say it again, and then probably going to say it a few more times after that. We have to configure the path at the bottom of this so that the path is correct. So before you activate this, if you've already jumped ahead, do not do this until we set the path. So for us to connect to a GCS bucket, we need credentials. And the credentials that it will use will be this email address, workshop@loggingdemo. This is the project name. This is a service account. I'm not going to step you through sort of how to create a service account, but it's really easy. It's just under the IAM users. You create a service account. You give it the role like a storage permission so that it can write to it. So we will use that email address. And it's going to need a bucket name, which in this case will be altitude SF. Altitude SF. And it's going to need a secret key. The secret key, conveniently, is here. Set the period to be short, because we're going to want to look at this fairly often. We're going to want to look at changes to this. So I would set the period to 60 seconds. We do not need a public key. You can leave that blank. Set the period to 60 seconds. And the important thing, once again, is going to be under advanced options. Let me just make this whole thing bigger. Whoa, too big. You're going to need to set a path. The path is going to be a directory within this bucket by the time we're done, so use your number. For the time being, leave the log prefix classic. We're going to talk about log prefixes in a second. So you have a name. It'll be your number, whatever GCS. Leave the log format, again, the default for now. Timestamp format is there, and it's kind of handy if you wanted to change, how the actual format works when you need it. Email address, the one copy pasted, workshop. Bucket name, altitude SF. Secret key, copy pasted. PGP public key, leave blank. And under advanced options, the path, your number, and a trailing slash. Do all of that, hit create, and then activate that version. So you'll have 2 logging endpoints now, one going to log entries, one going to the GCS bucket. So we have 2 endpoints. If any of you probably won't have seen this yet unless something got weird in the copying and pasting, but we also very recently added a kind of validation of logging endpoints. I could intentionally screw one of these up, but it will show up as a warning, same with the compilation warnings up here, and it'll give you a little bit more information about it didn't like the credentials or it wasn't able to connect if it's your syslog or something, if it was an actual connection error. We used to have a kind of internal tool which should tell you this, but now we've exposed it, so it'll show up. It also does take a minute. It has to try to connect, and then it has to get an error, and then it has to tell our configuration system, which will then give you a warning, but it's still pretty handy. So activate the version that you had. Give this, again, sort of some more time. Once you've activated that version, endpoints configured, at this point, we will need to log into GCS. So with the credentials that you had on a sort of piece of paper, you're going to want to get in and under the little hamburger menu guy, you're going to look for storage. And under storage, browser. And then in the bucket, altitude SF. And then it looks like there's an awful lot of buckets that are already created, which is great, because that means they worked. So you're going to see a lot of different files in here, and each of them is going to have almost no data in them. They're going to be spread across the different aggregators. Each aggregator is opening a file connection, writing to it, and then closing it on the period that you defined. So if you're setting it to 60 seconds, you're going to get roughly 10 files every 60 seconds. That's not ideal when you have, like, most people run those for an hour or whatever. One thing I'm just going to call out, though, blow that up. So this is a default syslog format, right? So it's going to have the sort of syslog call, it's going to have the timestamp the way you configured it, and then the variables sort of as configured, like what cache node it hit, and then the name of the endpoint that you used, and then sort of all the fields as you define them as sort of normal Apache-style logs. This, however, is not very helpful, having that kind of prefix in place when you're trying to do JSON. JSON is way more useful for everyone, but it is a pain in the ass if you're trying to just hand write it. Nobody wants to do that. I'm just going to touch briefly on a kind of historical thing with our logging system. We did previously had what we called version 1, V1 of our log formats, which didn't fully support all the Apache-style stuff. It didn't fully support certain other kind of string handling things. We since moved, I'm going to say 6 months or so ago, to version 2. For those of you who have not touched your Fastly configurations for a long time and you had a bunch of logging endpoints in there, it will prompt you to update them to version 2. Version 2, obviously, because it's newer, it's better. It's just got more stuff, and it handles varnish variables a whole lot better, but it does have a slightly different format for including things. However, along with that, or at least related to that, is a very handy thing, which is that you can change the prefix. Meaning that it doesn't have to be a syslog prefix. You can change the prefix to be none, meaning that when you're trying to just write out JSON, all you get is brackets and quotes, and you don't get the rest of it. So to do that, if we were going to create a logging endpoint that is just taking straight JSON, there's a few different ways you can do it. Section 7 of the website, of your website, has a couple different suggestions which we're not really going to dig into. One of them is basically a VCL library that one of my colleagues wrote, Leon. He's here. He's doing another talk later today. Leon, like the library's genius. It's also a little bit bonkers. It's a lot like Leon in the best possible way. He wrote this whole library that kind of takes pairs of like a key value pair. We can just look at it really quick. In VCL, and he sort of sets up a bunch of calls that goes and gets all the appropriate brackets and quotes and sort of the types. So basically what you do is where's the good example? You set some values as kind of headers while you're doing it, and then you set the sort of the type, and you call sort of different things. This is available on a GitHub repo. The link is sort of on the website here. It's interesting to try. If it was a way that you wanted to sort of structure the data of the log entries that you have, he takes it all and then he sort of assembles a big, long internal variable, and then he just logs that variable. And it handles a lot of the type handling for you, which is pretty nice. We're not going to do that. You can also, in the UI, if you just want to basically paste JSON, you can. So you can, if you had already crafted it in a way that you'd want to put it in, you can do that. The format for us, if you wanted to use a varnish variable directly, is the %, you escape it, and capital V. The information for this is on, the link is not here, but if you search in our docs for sort of log formats, the different formatting options that are in there. We're also not going to do this. We're going to do one fun thing using my favorite new feature of all time. Every new feature that we have is usually my favorite new feature of all time, but this most recent one is VCL snippets. How many of you did not know we had VCL snippets? How many of you have never heard of VCL snippets? All right, it's new to some of you. How many of you are actually using VCL snippets for anything useful? Some of you, excellent. You don't count. They are little bits of VCL that you can add without writing a whole custom VCL, without adding the whole template. Now, they do come in two flavors. You can add them to a configuration, but you also have a kind of versionless set, sort of like our Edge dictionaries, in that they exist as code that's referenceable by your configuration, but you can update it by the API, meaning you can kind of update that code on the fly without having to rev the version of the configuration, which is pretty nice. So we're going to use that to just drop in a log line. You could use it for, sort of some load balancing goodness. You could use it for, some people use it kind of instead of ACLs, like having a versionless ACL. Some people use it, though, for code that they want to programmatically change without actually having to log in and change the VCL. So we are going to do, we're going to use the same Google Cloud endpoint, but we're going to start writing JSON to it. However, we have to do one thing first. We have to do step 3 of section 7 of what this is we have to disable that Google Cloud endpoint. The reason that we're going to do that is because I told you, you have to have the endpoint configured in our configuration system so that we know where it exists and where traffic goes. Okay? However, what we're going to do is we're going to be adding an additional log line sort of directly to the configuration. And if we left it as is, it's actually going to do it twice. It's going to do it once because we told it as a configured endpoint, and then it would do it again because we're adding it as VCL. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn off the one that's configured through the portal, and then we're just going to take advantage of that configuration by kind of logging it directly. So if we go into the GCS endpoint that was configured, again, you will want to clone this configuration to get to the next version that we're going to work on. We will go into the logging endpoints that we have configured, and one of these, the Google Cloud Storage one, we are going to attach a condition. Now, you could normally do all sorts of fun things with conditions. You could set them, we'll talk about these at the end, you could set them to only log errors or only sample your logs or something. But in this case, we're just going to do a sort of a complete set where we're just going to turn it off. And we're going to apply the condition if, bang, rec.url. This is kind of our default for something that is always false. There will always be a URL that's part of a request. We can blow this up a little bit more. The name is anything, it's just a label. You're going to attach the condition, if not rec.url, and then save and apply to this bucket. And it will show it that this bucket now is sort of wrapped in this condition, meaning that it will never actually log, but the endpoint's still configured, so we can take advantage of it in other ways when we want to get in and deal with it. So we've disabled it. Do not yet activate this version because we're going to do some more stuff. It looks like that, more or less. We're going to make a change to this GCS endpoint. This is section 4, or part 4 on section 7, where again, we're going to, for the moment, leave the log format the same. But we are going to go to advanced options. You still have your path, and we're going to make this sucker blank. We will update that. So we've done 2 things. We added a condition, and we changed the format to blank. Last thing is we're going to add a snippet. Using the same configured endpoint, so you have to remember the name of the one that you were using, of the logging endpoint, because we're going to need to reference that. So you're going to create a VCL snippet. Menu on the left, create a new VCL snippet. This is there's an editor that's basically here. Where are we? The name of the snippet, again, doesn't really matter. It's just it's a label. The type does matter. It's going to be within subroutine. And we might as well just pick VCL log. Meaning this is where we're going to insert this little blob of VCL. Now, again, if you were using snippets for other fun things, you might want to put them in different places. In theory, for those of you who are used to serving stale, where you need the whole sort of VCL file to serve stale, you could actually replace that with 3 snippets that just do the pieces that you want. And it's kind of nice that if you have common, if you factor out code that applies to, you have lots of different sites, you have lots of different services, and you want the same thing applied to each of them, you can kind of, you could apply the same snippets to each one. We don't yet share snippets across services, but we're doing a bunch of work around that. So the VCL that you're going to use is going to be the one that's supplied here. And what it's going to do, I did a trick to this one. Kind of hope it works. We're going to log. We're going to create the same log line, but we're actually going to pull the service ID of what it is that we're going to use, just to show that the thing that, like, when you're actually creating the log line, you might as well, take advantage of different things that are in there. We're actually just going to pull the service ID to insert it, and here's the key bit. You have to change this line. The last part is the actual name of the endpoint that we're going to be logging to, and this will be the name of the GCS endpoint that is configured on your service. So in this case, it's 95 GCS. So the logging endpoint in this one is Fastly Log Workshop 99, but you're going to want to actually put in the endpoint name that is configured on the GCS bucket of yours. And all this one is just has sort of one key value in JSON. It's super simple. It's just the URL and just the actual value of the URL. So we will create that snippet, and we will activate. And we can go in and see what it actually did. So under options, you can get it show VCL. Scroll all the way down to the bottom, or at least to almost the bottom. And we can see a couple of things that are configured here under VCL log. You can look in your own generated VCL as well, for sure. But we have the one that we just added as a snippet. So we have log, syslog, the thing that we just did. We also have the log entries one that we did earlier. This has the service ID sort of hard configured, the name of the endpoint. And we have the other GCS endpoint that we actually had configured through the UI that is wrapped in a condition to make it false, so it'll never actually do it. So again, this all comes back to the fact that the logging system needs to know the details. It has to be configured through the configuration system. And whether or not Varnish chooses to log to it, that's a separate question. You can absolutely log more than once within the same sequence. And many people do that as a kind of debugging thing. Like you can use it like print statements, basically. If you're changing things throughout your VCL, like throughout a request sequence, that during receive, the actual, the URL is something, and then it changes to something later, and you're trying to figure out what the heck is actually going on, you can log in different subroutines as many times as you want. So you basically can get a step-by-step of the whole flow through the Varnish request of all of each of the variables that you're looking for and the state that they're in at that moment. So you can sort of we happen to be calling VCL log within VCL log, but you can call VCL log from within receive or fetch in different places. Okay, so that should be there. We can send some traffic to this guy. And if we go back and look in our bucket, we'll scroll down to roughly the time that we're at now. We'll pick a random file, and it looks like JSON. So it doesn't have all that prefix stuff. And the difference is that you just change the logging prefix in the logging configuration from classic to blank. Just blow that up. So all it did is sort of wrote out the snippet of what the snippet told it to do. Now, obviously, you can pack that full of as much JSON as you want. And at this point, we have JSON that is configured. It's going to the place that you want. At this point, it's like to a bucket, which is nice, but it would be better if it was going to a place like sort of directly where you can take advantage of it, which is where Mehan from Google is going to come sort of give us some information about BigQuery, and then we can talk about how we can get this information in BigQuery and how you can take advantage of it.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Murad Nazir. I'm a custom engineer with the Google Cloud team, so I support a number of different accounts on their technical solutioning on the Google Cloud platform. And what I'm going to be talking about today is BigQuery, one of our I'd say, most popular products on the Google Cloud platform. Before I dive into this, how many people here, just as a show of hands, have worked with BigQuery before? Okay, how about Redshift? Okay, I see a thumbs down over there. So I'm going to kind of quickly talk through what BigQuery is about, but also kind of bring it to life a little bit, show a little example. For the uninitiated, what is BigQuery? Basically, BigQuery is Google Cloud's enterprise data warehouse analytics service. That's a lot of buzzwords, but essentially it's Google's analytics as a service offering. What does that mean? It's a petabyte scale, very fast performant database. The real innovation that was built there was it's basically a decoupling of compute and storage. And the way it's designed is such that it is a columnar database. So as opposed to scanning things in a very relational database way, it's scanning things just by columns. Each column is stored in a file, and because it basically knows exactly, and every column is basically one certain data type, it can more efficiently scan through a data warehouse. And to get a sense for how fast that is, Lloyd's Banking Group, they worked with us to basically bring all their data into BigQuery. And their turnaround time went from 96 hours to 30 minutes. Spotify's built their entire data warehousing solution on top of BigQuery. And if you think about kind of the agility and nimbleness that this gives you, it's a very empowering thing. So I'll quickly talk through kind of like how Google BigQuery came to be. And that kind of deserves, it's kind of a quick diversion into the open source story of Google. Actually, funny enough, BigQuery actually came out of a need internally to focus on and basically analyze our logs. If you think about trying to index the internet and trying to trying to basically provide search recommendations, you need something that's very, very performant and very, very fast. And there's a general pattern for how Google kind of tackles this kind of problems. Usually comes out with the Google white paper of some internal research. Here's a list of the papers that came out of that. Out of those papers comes some kind of open source project. So if you look at GFS, that was kind of the precursor to HDFS. MapReduce was, again, the precursor to MapReduce. And when we're talking about BigQuery, the internal project that we were really talking about is Dremel. Dremel is the analytical framework that's used for the BigQuery product. And the last step is kind of externalizing that in form of a Google Cloud product. BigQuery has been around for a couple years now, but as we see it kind of mature in the market, we see it being built in with a lot more functionality that's friendly to a larger population. And once again, just kind of reiterating this story here, it's really goes from white paper to an open source, and that implementation is available to basically every customer that wants to sign up for the Google Cloud Platform. So back to kind of the high-level talking points to the BigQuery. It's a very, very familiar format. So for people that are working in a very data science-oriented role or are used to relational databases, it's a SQL format that's very, very familiar. I'm sure Chris will show a demo, and I'll show a demo shortly afterwards. Encrypted, durably, and highly available, right? So once again, for the price of basically infrequent access storage, you are getting a very highly performant database, as well as a very, favorable pricing model that's basically just pay as you go. And not only that, the data is replicated by default, and you aren't having to pay for that. It's baked into the price. And the last thing I want to take away with is really the fact that BigQuery is a fully managed and serverless database. When you're working with other data warehousing solutions, you are thinking about how many clusters do I need to provision, how many machines, what kind of machines, and scaling that up and down as your querying needs basically change. And the whole premise behind BigQuery is no longer you have to worry about that, no longer you have to worry about managing and basically provisioning machines. You're now basically just working right off the bat. The data's in the platform, and running queries right from there. So when you think about it from a data scientist standpoint, you're really thinking about three things. One, how to export that data into BigQuery. Two, what that database schema will look like. And three, what exactly you're going to query and how you're going to design those queries. So just another way of looking at it, if you think about kind of managing your own on-premise infrastructure or working with an infrastructure as a service provider like Redshift and Amazon, you're thinking about a lot of things, right? Not only are you thinking about programming the actual data and focusing on insights, you're thinking about monitoring, resource allocation, utilization and reliability, and a lot of things that are more or less operational, but not necessarily add value to what you're trying to kind of extract. And what Google's particular premise is, again, instead of focusing on the infrastructure, focusing on the insights. So the last thing I'll do is kind of walk through a quick demo of what this looks like in a real environment. And I'm just going to go through some sample queries. So right now we have a couple, we have a few data sets that are publicly available. I'll make this a little bigger if that helps. And what you'll see is this is just a query of Shakespeare's top works, and basically identifying which characters have the most lines and by how many lines they have. If we run this query, as you can see, it'll show you kind of the query runtime. And as you see, it's not a trivial query. There's a regular expression here along with a filter, and it returns again, the name of the character, the amount of words they are saying, as well as what corpus they're coming from, right? Not that earth-shattering, but let's talk through another data set, the Wikipedia data set. So again, Wikipedia data set is available to anyone that kind of dig around in. And as you can see, it's a public data sample. If you look at that data sample, it'll give you kind of an overview of the schema along with the data types. And more interesting and more relevant to this is the details, right? So we're talking about a 36 gigabyte file with about 313 million rows. And once again, we're just demonstrating with gigabytes. The more interesting options are when you get to the hundreds of terabytes and petabyte scale. That's usually the kind of routine, the kind of scale of data that we're working with. So just as kind of an educational exercise, what are the most vandalized articles on Wikipedia? And that's usually commented in the metadata. How do we go about searching for that? So once again, there's a sample query here that will again filter for the specific word vandalism, group by title, and just a very standard SQL query, right? Once again, within 4 seconds, we've basically looked through 20 gigabytes and returned particular titles that have been vandalized. George Bush, Wikipedia, RuneScape, places like that. And the last thing I'm going to show is, I think, kind of giving you an idea of how the BigQuery data warehousing solution scales. So once again, we have a pretty elaborate query. I'll walk you through it as I kind of go through this, but let's start off with just 1 million rows, right? So you'll see right here, Wikipedia benchmark wiki 1 million. And if you run this query, again, it took about 2 seconds, 58 megabytes, and again, returns answers pretty quickly, right? Not that interesting, but why don't we actually increase this by a factor of 10, right? So once again, conventional wisdom would say it'll take 10 times as long. But in fact, it's actually a little bit shorter. It processes 10 times as much as that data set, but once again, it's not taking any longer. Well, actually, let's make this a little bit more interesting. Let's make this 1,000 times bigger, or actually 100 times bigger, with the 1 billion rows, right? You're running this query here. We'll see the query is running in the background. And once again, it's now processed 56 gigabytes, but at the same time, its performance has not degraded whatsoever. And again, we have the ability to kind of look at the query and see at the different stages at which the query has basically executed. And what about just one more? Let's just actually go up to 100 billion, right? So again, what you would think is this is going to take, it could take significantly longer. And if you look at the query, it's not trivial, right? We have a regular expression looking for all titles that start with a G, have 2 O's, and end in an E, right? You're looking across a very heavy data set across 100 billion rows, and you're basically summing up the amount of views for all of them. This is something that could take, when you're thinking about all the kind of activity you need to do to run this on your own data warehouse or a much more less managed solution, you have to think about which machines you are provisioning, X, Y, and Z. And with BigQuery, you'll see that within 38 seconds, you've now basically processed 4.4 terabytes, which is what, about maybe 20, 30 times as much as what we just did before. Yet we have basically an answer that basically gets to our needs. And if you think about it from a data scientist standpoint, as well as an analytical standpoint, you have a much more agile and nimble framework, especially in a logging capacity when you're trying to identify specific problems or diagnosing particular issues or certain traffic patterns. This enables you to do that in a much more efficient and, agile way. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Chris to kind of run on the SQL on the Fastly data. But if there are any questions about BigQuery, we can address them afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sure. So we'll dive into BigQuery a bunch, and then we should have some time at the end to sort of talk about some of the analytical tools that are available out of BigQuery. There's some examples maybe with Data Studio. We are very happy to announce, some of you have been eagerly awaiting this for a while. We previously at this point, when I was talking about this kind of stuff, I would have said, all right, you have a Google bucket, you have some JSON in it, you can point BigQuery at a bucket as a data source, and then you can use BigQuery to sort of pull that data in. As of more or less yesterday, we have available for your configuration pleasure we are going to go to a new version. We're going to add another logging endpoint. And in this case, we are going to add a new endpoint. And again, we're scaled down really small. However, you will note, on this account, unfortunately not on your account just yet, it's in limited availability, we are able to log directly to Google BigQuery, which means you can kind of skip that whole middle step of dropping things in a bucket or doing sort of other pub sub type things. So the instructions for how to connect to this are in section 8. And since we already have a way of doing JSON, why don't we just write some JSON directly to BigQuery and then run some reports off it? And for those of you who have large logging infrastructures and sort of have to deal with whole pipelines of dealing with data coming in and archiving it and backing it out and all kinds of stuff, the idea would be is that we would be able to just get rid of that whole middle section and just drop everything directly into BigQuery. And because the sort of response time from BigQuery, if we're able to write to it within seconds, we're streaming it in there. It is available within BigQuery within seconds. If you're having you need to answer a question, you need to sort of figure out what's happening with client connections at the edge. You can have that information as quickly as you can write SQL. We are going to do two things. First thing we're going to do is actually in the Google control within the Cloud Console. So the first link on there is going to take you into, or the first link on there is actually the docs, the Fastly docs for how to set it up. But we're going to connect to BigQuery.console google.cloud.com, which should take us into a window that's very much like this. We're going to need to create a table that will exist so that we can then stream stuff to it. So to create a table, it is under the altitude data set. So when you log into BigQuery, that data set should be there. You should be able to expand it. There's already a couple tables that are already there. We're going to add a new one. So it's under the little the little plus. Let me just make this window bigger. Close the query. And we are going to create an empty table. So the little radio button on the right. Make that one step bigger still. And you're going to give it a name, which in this case is going to be your number again. And when we need to reference this to query, you're going to be querying your particular table. So this is what it's going to create. Now, if you were pulling from a bucket that was already valid JSON, BigQuery is actually really good about doing sort of automatically detect schema. In this case, there's no data in it yet, so we're going to give it a schema. So if you scroll down a little bit here, we're going to give it a schema because we're going to be defining a certain sort of set of JSON logging that's going to go in there. So you can copy paste that from the website, select edit as text, drop that in, and then you should be able to create it. So that'll then pop in the schema. So select edit as text, take this as it is. It will have pre-placed a little string in that field. You delete the extra one. So these are the fields that it's going to expect. And so to give it those fields, the data that it expects, we're going to create a BigQuery endpoint on the Fastly side. So the data that you need is going to be in part 2 of section 8. So this is the label of the endpoint that we're going to configure. We're going to call this 95 BigQuery. And the log format is very important. You're going to want to take this in its entirety. The email address. So these are the credentials that it's going to use to actually connect to BigQuery. The secret key is actually the same one as before. This one, however, needs the project ID. The data set will be altitude. And the table will be the table name that you created, which in my case was 95. Template you can leave blank. And we'll create that endpoint. So now we have 3 configured, and we'll activate that version. And again, just sort of generate some traffic. Spend some time doing this. But ultimately, you can sort of prep some queries that we might want to try out. There won't be any data in this table yet. It's still sort of streaming in there. It probably haven't actually configured yet. However, we're going to try some queries. There's a couple samples on the website there. This one is not going to return any rows, so it's probably not a good one to start with. Although I'm going to do it against, this against a different table that had something there. This one is one of my particular favorites. What it's doing is it's checking against a previous table that already had some random data going against it, where it's looking for where the refer is blank, meaning that it probably is some sort of crawler, or else it was a person hitting an actual page. And it's looking for PNGs. So the actual URL contains a PNG. Meaning that there are some smart crawlers out there, there are smarter crawlers out there for sure that can sort of simulate the whole thing. But it is very possible that someone's scraping your website. Someone's grabbing images sort of mechanically by just going off and actually getting images like all the PNGs. And if it doesn't have a refer, it means that it didn't actually load the page and then decide to go and ask for those images. And so if you run a query like this, you're going to end up seeing all the people who sort of asked for certain PNGs. In this case, it was with a curl client that did not actually have a refer that's attached to it. Most objects, pretty much all sub-objects on a page, should have the parent page as a refer. There's also a query on here that you should be able to run that would get response times by city and by country and start sorting them out. Now, average elapsed seconds, that's actually probably the header label we set is wrong because this should be milliseconds. Oh no, it's doing math. Perfect, because it did start out as microseconds. So you can start getting a sense of which objects are actually taking longer. Now you start correlating that with things that are hits and misses, so then you can start getting very detailed information sort of per route. We obviously provide in the dashboard, we provide origin latency, which is nice. We sort of get a general sense of, from our perspective, how long it takes for us to go to origin to get content. But if you're trying to dig into more detail than that, you might potentially get that information from something like New Relic. If you don't have New Relic and you wanted to start getting information about which particular routes, when going to origin, were taking longer than others. And maybe that then helps you dig into a database query on your side, which is going crazy or something like that. And again, the more data you can add to these logs, the more creative you can get when you're sort of trying to dig into them. We are getting tight on time. So there's definitely do get things set up into BigQuery. Continue to screw around with that. If you happen to know SQL and like SQL, you can add some more fields to it. You can sort of get a sense of the types of things you'd like to do. We kind of rushed through this last little bit, my apologies. But you did log to BigQuery, and you are special, because most people can't do that yet. I get pinged almost every other week by certain customers. It's like, can I log to BigQuery yet? And the answer very soon will be yes. This is still in limited availability. If this is urgently interesting to you and you're a Fastly customer, talk to me or talk to Simon after, and we can make sure we get that enabled. We talked a lot about logs. We talked a lot about the mechanics of logs. What we didn't talk about is why this is even potentially that useful for you. And obviously, the insight that you get is great. You can certainly do all kinds of reporting. You can learn what's happening at the edge. That's all fun. But the logging really is only just part of our platform, and it's one of the things that we think is actually essential to having the knowledge of what's happening not only with your clients, but sort of within the configuration within the CDN itself. Because what we're going to be asking you to do, and what a lot of the other talks and sessions are about today, is we offer a lot more than just delivery. We are a CDN, obviously. We deliver cached content. We deliver uncached content. We do all that. But at the same time, we do provide other fun things. We do global load balancing, and we give you kind of data at the edge and logic at the edge. And if you're going to take advantage of these to build applications, to build paywalls and things like that, you are going to want to have the ability to debug it, to basically instrument an application that's happening at the edge. And the way that you can best do that is with logging. And you can do that because you can sort of define it in a way that gives you the information that when and how you want it. It also enables a couple more fun things that potentially you might consider doing. And we already have some customers, some publishing customers who are already doing this, where if you have an event, like a beacon of some kind on your page, like how many of you have some sort of reporting thing that comes up that says someone moused over an image or something like that? You have information that's going up, it's hitting a server, the server's just sending like a 204 or something like that, that server's processing that request and it's dropping it in a database. Now, some people I know, for any one page that they're doing, they might be firing 10 different beacons, 10 different events as users scroll up the page and different things become visible. You could, and people have definitely done this, we can serve a synthetic response. We can send a 204, or we can send a transparent pixel or something like that. So if all you care about is the fact that the event happened, what you do is you configure us to just receive that event and log it directly to where you want it to go. And those servers, which previously handled all of that event tracking, aren't needed, especially now that it can go directly into BigQuery or sort of pretty much wherever you want it to go. So that can shortcut what is effectively unnecessary, because the user, the fact that the event occurred is the most important part. And we're the one that they're already telling it to. Why we should hand it off to another server, I don't really know. There is also a variable that's available within VCL, which is rec.postBody. Currently, it's only the first 2K of the body of a post. We're doing some work to sort of make that expanded. One thing you could do with this, and we've built this as sort of applications that will work. If you have a user form, they type in their name, they fill out a bunch of stuff, they hit submit. It's going to post it to us. We're going to get that post body, and that post body is available in VCL. If you wanted to take that VCL and slice it up into a bunch of different fields and then log it directly, you could actually have people fill out a form, hit submit, and it would go straight into a database without it ever touching anything on your infrastructure. So it's happening entirely at the edge, where we get that information, we send it where it needs to go in the format that you want it in, and people talk about serverless applications, and this is legit serverless. And this is just kind of an example of what we're talking about when we say we want you to move this type of logic closer to the client where it's going to get the best kind of performance. You're going to move it out to the edge. We're going to be talking a lot over the next couple of days about us as an edge cloud. We are obviously part of the cloud. We are distributed. We are also the best part of the cloud from the user's perspective, because that is where the performance is going to be, and it's sort of potentially gives you the opportunity to then do routing across different origins and all kinds of things, but we act as that kind of layer between your users and wherever else you want it to go. We have a little bit of time left, very little. Are there any questions that I will almost immediately transfer over to Adam or Simon? But yes, actually, let me just grab the mic for this gentleman.
Much for the presentation. So it sounds like Fastly does not have native alerting dashboard. So it's up to endpoint to set up those alerts. If my traffic drops somehow,
yeah.
I have to actually see those endpoints either on S3 bucket or in a Google bucket. But can you have like some kind of native alerting mechanism on Fastly? Yeah. Thank you.
So one way a lot of people will get that is they'll get it from the stats, or like actually the analytics feed, which is a real-time feed, and then they set thresholds basically, so that if they have a certain expectation that, and if traffic drops, it triggers something internally. We do not currently have sort of external hooks out to send something to alerts. As soon as we sort of launch BigQuery, I know the very next thing that people are going to say is, well, I want to do PubSub, or I want to do sort of other endpoints. One of the things that came out of this is our ability, we do have a kind of generic HTTP endpoint that's going to be available for logs. And conceivably, you could take advantage of that. That you could log conditionally just errors. And you might actually send those to an HTTP endpoint, which then sends you a hook to do the thing that you want to do. So we do not have alerting internally within the product, but it has always been our goal to kind of give you the information as quickly and as thoroughly as we can. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all very, very much.